That sounds a little bit sort of lefty Corbynista.
It's the reality. It's the reality of the financial transaction. And I just think it's wrong.
Now, with me today, it's our great pleasure to introduce Richard Tice, who's Deputy Leader of Reform UK. Now, the genesis of this interview is that I wrote a column in which I was quite rude about Richard's economic policies. In fact, I described them as fantasy, which didn't provide any kind of a credible platform for government. So let's go in full frontal, as it were, and take on that allegation that this is simply not a credible platform for government.
Well, look, this was our election contract last July, based on the information we had at the time, and there were three big savings that I think people haven't sufficiently focused on, which, and in your article you did focus on the one that most people don't understand, which is that the Bank of England is voluntarily paying interest on the printed money, what's called the quantitative easing, and it doesn't have to do that decision. Other central banks are not. If you're negotiating on behalf of the taxpayer, you obviously adopt the most advantageous position. We put a number on that of just over £30 billion a year. Deputy governors, former deputy governors of the Bank of England, other economists agree that that is doable. The second big saving is if you scrap net zero, you don't have to spend all the tens of billions of pounds that the Climate Change Committee say have to be spent, and we are currently embarked upon spending. And then the third one, maybe the most controversial one, is I said we need to save £5 in 100 across government spending, in the same way that at home we're trying to save money while still paying the bills, paying the mortgage, and in businesses. I reckon I'm probably one of the most successful MPs in Parliament in a business career. I've run a multi-billion pound multinational business, tripled the share price in 4 years. I sold out before the crash. I'm not a muppet. I know what I'm doing. I feel very strongly that, of course, we're not going to have a huge round of tax cuts without showing we can deliver on the savings. If you can show you can deliver on the savings, then you can afford the tax cuts and the efficiency improvements. I think that's probably the thrust of people's concern.
Is that not something of a change from what you said in your manifesto, since you did actually say that you do all these tax cuts, and there are a lot of them, and they're very bold, and I would agree with a lot of them. In an ideal world, that's what you do. But you said you do all this in your first 100 days.
So we said we would...
Have you changed that position?
So what we say is we can announce a direction of travel, but clearly you've also got to do what is achievable, and you've got to be cognizant of the bond market.
So you wouldn't do them in your first 100 days?
You could announce the direction of travel,
yes, sure,
on some of them. You could do some of them on literally in the first 100 days, and that's the blend, and you've got to prove the saving. You want entrepreneurs to come back to the UK, say, yeah, I see the direction of travel, I get their ambition, I'm going to come back to the UK, I'm going to start investing and regenerate my enthusiasm for helping to grow the UK economy.
Well, let's take your savings, and let's start with public sector waste. Everybody agrees there's a lot of it. It should be easy to cut. But you're a businessman. I've come across lots of businessmen who've gone into politics, and they find that once they're in politics, it is completely different. It's not as easy as it looks, is what I'm saying.
I just don't think we've had the calibre of politicians for the last 20 years who dig in, who've got a successful track record. And I think you can learn the lessons of the past, and we identify that's a failing. And part of that failing is because the civil service has acted as too much of a block. And you have to go in there very clearly, as we are already now doing with the 10 councils that we've won just a few weeks ago. And we're saying, hang on, you don't need to spend that 20 million quid on a new fire station, for example. Let's just pause and rethink. We've already identified in some places almost £1 million worth of salary savings. I've said, don't trust a word. Don't take anything for granted. Look under the lid of everything. And that's what you've got to do in departments. And you've got to say to civil servants, listen folks, if we've been elected on this mandate, we're going to deliver it with or without you. And there'll be some very tough, robust discussions. And you've got to have people with the courage to say, if you're going to be a block, if you're going to get in the way, then we're going to have to move you out of the way.
Let's come on to what you have rightly identified as the sort of pointy-headed, rather complex area of savings, which is to get rid of payment of interest on central bank reserves. And a lot of people find it quite hard to get their head around this. But I'm not aware of any economists who've said that you should get rid of the entire lot.
The taxpayer essentially printed all this money to keep the economy afloat during the financial crisis in 2008 and then during the COVID crisis in 2020, 2021. So I don't think the taxpayer should be shafted by paying voluntary interest that enriches city institutions.
But he's not been shafted because, I mean, there were considerable profits realised by the government on QE, and they took that money, nothing to do with you, obviously, it was the previous late governments. They took that money, they banked it, and they spent it. And, in simple accounting terms, you now have to offset those losses. And that's what's going on at the moment.
I don't agree
that's
at all.
Effectively what's going on.
The losses that are being triggered at the moment, and it is a voluntary decision, with no accountability, and I'll come on to that in a second. Most ordinary people have almost no savings at all. They've got 2 to 3 weeks of living money, right?
Yeah.
And they're the people that actually are losing out on this. And it's a transfer of wealth from the taxpayer to rich city institutions and their wealthy customers. And I just think it's wrong.
That sounds a little bit sort of lefty Corbynista.
It's the reality. It's the reality of the financial transaction. The other point is that the Bank of England is voluntarily deciding to do what's called quantitative tightening, which is where they're actually they're essentially selling these created printed money bonds back into the market, which means that guess what? The bond market investors, they know when this is happening, so they're a bit more demanding on the price they require. That is triggering tens of billions of losses of taxpayers' cash. And I think it's an outrage that there is no scrutiny or accountability.
Those losses would come through eventually.
No, they wouldn't.
Unless interest rates return to where they were during
those losses would not come through. And I'm very upset that the Bank of England Monetary Committee is, in my view, negligently forcing these losses now on the taxpayer.
Well, this is one of these issues.
It is a bit quirky. It's not very
where
sexy.
we are going to disagree, because I would regard it as at least a technical default, and I think it would send out a pretty bad signal to international investors, because they think that there is a kind of contract to pay interest on reserves. When they see that the British banking system is deprived of that, they'll think, oh, that's not a very good regime to deal with. We won't invest there. Well, let's go to the big numbers, because Simon French has said that your policies would lead to an immediate and violent sterling crisis if you ever came to power. And he says that it would leave you with a fiscal gap of something, by his calculation, 70 to 80 billion.
We're not going to impose all of the cuts and do a quarteng without delivering on the savings. Unfortunately, I think we have had some clowns running the show.
So there's no putting the cart before the horse, as far as you're concerned.
Of course not. And
so
we never said we would.
The 100-day commitment would not actually happen in
the 100-day
practice.
commitment was a direction of travel. With regard to the calculations, look, we had 2 economists look at the numbers, produce the spreadsheets. I think what some people are not doing is, if you have so you deliver the saving, you then do the tax cut. When you do a tax cut, what happens to the money which doesn't go to the HMRC? It stays in the pocket of the consumer. What does the consumer do with it? They spend it, which means you get what's called a multiplier effect. So you create more VAT revenues, more growth, more activity, more national insurance contributions. But to suggest that it's 70 to 100 billion out is frankly make-believe. I mean, that's where the fantasy is.
Why are you different, though? I mean, I think the first time I heard the expression bonfire of red tape was from Michael Heseltine, and that must have been in the 1980s or something like that.
I'll tell you why I'm different, because I've been
and every government has come into power saying we are going to get rid of regulation.
And there's almost never been successful business people running the key departments of office.
Would you keep the Office for Budget Responsibility?
I call them the Office for Incompetent Forecasting.
So you wouldn't?
So in its current guise, unless it dramatically changes its performance over the next 4 years, then I think they might need to think again. The day of the spring statement, they said that the net borrowing for the year to the end of March would be £137 billion. 4 weeks later, they were wrong by £15 billion, over 10%. I looked at the spring statement numbers in the chamber. I said to Nigel, these numbers are delusional. I looked at them in half an hour. I knew the numbers. I knew they were wrong.
Right, okay. I mean, you're obviously right to say that the UK is in a lot of trouble. Would you be committed to getting that debt down as a proportion of GDP before you started engaging in the sort of tax cuts that you've talked about?
The best way to get it down, actually, is to grow faster.
Yes, regulations. But that's pie in the sky when you
I'm sorry, I just don't agree. Look, we're old enough to remember in the 80s and 90s, the UK economy was growing at between 2.5% and 3.5% every single year. We got worried if it was less than 2%. Less than 1% was a moral recession. Now 0.5% is considered an excuse for breaking out the champagne. So I don't accept we can't grow faster. But to do that, you don't need mass immigration, you don't need net zero, and you don't need daft historic EU regulations.
Because it's not that easy, is what I'm saying.
The truth is that if you have very high taxes, if you have high immigration, you have net zero, you have high government debt, you can't grow in the same way that fast-growing nations are growing. I'm an optimist. I think you can turn this around in the same way that a bad boss can ruin a good business in a couple of years, but a good boss can turn around a business ineffective receivership, and we're not far from that. You can turn that round in 2 to 3 years with a sense of optimism. 2 to 3 years? Well, you can create a direction of travel.
The essence of the criticism comes down to this. Yes, people are very disillusioned with both the Conservatives and Labour. The Conservatives because they broke their promises on immigration. Labour has now broken its promises on taxes. Reform has traded very considerably on that, but it's kind of easy to mobilise the frustrations of voters. It's not so easy to govern.
Which is why, as I say, in a sense, now we're actually governing councils, managing things. We've got to perform, we've got to deliver, and we'll get lots right. But of course, we'll make mistakes. But I think if we're honest about that, then hopefully people will see, actually, they're dealing with some frontline stuff, not wasting money over here on a load of nonsense.
So no conversation with a leading member of Reform would be complete without some mention of Brexit. So what do you make of the government's reset announced yesterday with the European Union?
I've called it a surrender on steroids. I mean, essentially, the Prime Minister is kissing goodbye to Brexit. He never wanted it, and he's basically handcuffing us to the EU through the back door, not the front door. It's a sellout of fishing for 12 years when the EU only wanted 4. They couldn't believe their luck. And it's a sellout on freedom of movement, again through a new newly badged youth experience scheme, which all sounds jolly nice.
Well, Richard, I mean, it's probably 4.5 years to the next general election. Seems unlikely that Labour will give up power before then. So there's a lot of water that can flow under the bridge in that time. And you will, now that you're riding high in the polls, be subjected to a lot more scrutiny than you have been hitherto. So I wish you luck.
Thank you very
much for coming in and talking to us. Bye for now.